During the fall, there are a lot of different lures and techniques that you can use to go out there and catch a bass. But one of the most consistent ways to catch a quality fish, a big fish in a lot of our different lakes, rivers, and ponds is with a jig. But if you think about fall time fishing, the start of fall looks vastly different than the end of fall. The start of fall is like basically summertime, where the end of fall is wintertime. You have very different conditions that happen throughout there, and a jig can still be a really good bait throughout that entire time period. But there are three big things that you need to take in consideration when it comes to fishing a jig in the fall. So in this video, we're gonna talk all about that, starting with number one, selecting the right jig. Now, when I say selecting the right jig, I'm not specifically talking about a brand of jigs, because guess what? I use a ton of different brands. Like, I've used some of the big name brands like Berkley and Strike King. I've used some of the smaller company jigs like Blue Rock, Warrior, Outcast Tackle, and I like a ton of different jigs out there on the market. But when I say selecting the right jig, I'm really referring to a couple of big characteristics about our jigs that are very important in the fall. Now, the two characteristics that I think are the most important when it comes to jig, and no, I'm not going to talk about color, I'm going to talk about the weight of our jig and the trailer that we put on the jig. Those to me are the two most important things to remember when it comes to fishing a jig, because to me, colors like black and blues, green pumpkins, whites, like they all catch fish during this time of the year, but the weight and the trailer are very important and can mean the difference between you catching fish and not catching fish. Now, let's first talk about the weight of our jigs. You know, like I said, in the beginning of fall, you're dealing with a lot of warmer water conditions, and warm water is going to be relative to where you live in the country. You know, if you live down in Texas or Florida, warm water may be 90 degrees. If you live up in the Midwest, like where I live, warm water is mid 70s, maybe in the 80-degree range. Now, in the start of fall, I typically like a pretty heavy jig, a 1/2 ounce jig, a 5/8 ounce jig. I like something that is going to plummet past the bass fairly quickly. I do not want the bass to get a really good look at the jig during this time of the year, because these fish have been pretty pressured throughout the entire summer. In the start of fall, you're still dealing with fish that are feeling the pressure, and I've seen a lot of different baits out there, and that heavy jig falling quickly past their face can a lot of times cause those fish to react to it. Now, the later into fall we get, the colder the water that you get, the slower of fall rate that I want, and the lighter of jig that I want. So a lot of times, by the time I get to the very end of fall, I am going to be using a 1/4 ounce jig. And if you think about it, when it comes to cold water, there's a lot of things in nature that simply are not moving really quickly. I mean, crawfish, shad, bluegill, the bass themselves, they're not all out there moving as fast as they were when it was warm water, because their metabolism has slowed down. And so if you use that same 1/2 ounce jig or 5/8 ounce jig in cold water, I'm not saying you won't go out there and get a few bites, but you may get a lot less bites if you're using a big jig versus that smaller jig that is a 1/4 ounce jig and has a really slow fall rate. Now, the only caveat to that is that it also depends on how you are working the jig. You know, a lot of times I'm doing small hops with my jig, but there are times in late fall where I'm actually just dragging a jig across the bottom, maybe an offshore rock pile or brush pile or stump. In that situation, the size and the weight of your jig doesn't matter as much, because really you're just dragging that bait. So whether you're dragging a 1/4 ounce bait or a 5/8 ounce bait, it doesn't look that vastly different to a bass. And sometimes actually using a little bit heavier weight can help you to feel the bottom a little bit better down there. Now, I will still say that a lighter weight will actually get you more bites, but you may be a lot less efficient down there actually bringing that bait across the water. So there's always a few things that you need to take in consideration, not only the water temperatures, but also how you are fishing the jig. Now, let's talk about trailers, because trailers are very, very important when it comes to this time of the year in the fall. During the beginning part of the fall, again, you're dealing with warm water. I like a trailer that has a lot of a kick to it. You know, a Strike King Rage Crawl, a Berkeley Chigger Crawl. These baits that have a lot of kick to them are the ones that I go with a lot of times at the start of fall. Now, when it comes again to cold water jig fishing, you do not want a bait that has a lot of kick. And for the same reasons that we didn't want a jig that falls really fast. I want a jig that has a trailer on it that has very little action. So as the water starts to get really, really cold, I like to go with more of a chunk style trailer. Those are the trailers that get me a lot more bites during this time of the year, because again, there's not a lot of things out there that have a ton of motion in them in cold water. And so having something that's very subtle is typically going to get you more bites down there. Now, I will use a chunk style trailer whether I'm hopping that bait or dragging it. It is just something that I use in cold water. And I do think that the ones that have scent infused in them, whether that is like your old pork style trailers or even like the Berkeley Max Scent chunk trailers, those ones are the ones that I really like on my jigs in cold water, because I think that scent becomes even that much more important in cold water. Now, one other thing that I want to talk about when it comes to your tackle is actually the line that you are using. I don't necessarily change up my rod a lot when it comes to fishing a 5/8 ounce jig and a 1/4 ounce jig, although I have done that in the past. But the line does make a big difference. When I'm using a 1/2 ounce jig, a 5/8 ounce jig, I like 20 pound, 25 pound fluorocarbon even. But when I'm using a 1/4 ounce jig, that 20 pound fluorocarbon really is a little bit too much to handle that jig. I'm not saying you can't use it and not use it efficiently and effectively. And sometimes it may even be necessary if you're dealing with really heavy cover, but using 12 pound, 14 pound, 15 pound fluorocarbon as opposed to 20 or 25 makes a huge difference on the feel of that jig as you're fishing it in colder water. So typically the colder water that I am fishing, the little bit lighter pound test that I want to use. Now, before we get into tip number 2 when it comes to fall time jig fishing, I do want you guys to remember that we're getting into the Christmas time of the year, the time where you are buying for your friends and your family. And I just wanted to say, I highly suggest checking out the fin fishing gear. Check out the sun shirts, one of the only sun shirts made in the US. Check out the duck hats, a waterproof, lightweight, very durable hat. Check out the shorts. Check out any of the gear over at Fin Fishing. If you do that, you really help support this channel. So I'm gonna leave some links down below for fin fishing. Tip number 2 is actually dead sticking. I feel like you used to hear guys talk about dead sticking their baits a lot more back in the day than you do these days. And I think that when you're fishing a jig in the fall, dead sticking becomes a very good way, a very great technique at catching more fish. Now, most of you are gonna know what I mean by dead sticking. If you don't, it's literally what it sounds like. You are going to cast the bait out and you're gonna let that thing sit motionless down there on the bottom. You're not gonna move it, you're not gonna drag it slowly, you're literally just gonna let it sit there. And I have seen several days out there on the water where dead sticking a jig in the fall is the deal at catching fish. Now, I think the biggest reason that this becomes such a good technique with a jig in the fall is because depending on where you live in the country, you will have a crawfish spawn in the fall time. And if you think about a crawfish coming out onto rocks to kind of look for males looking for females, females looking for males, they're not going to be jumping all over the place like we normally work a jig. They're just going to come up out on those rocks and be kind of looking around, moving really slowly. I think a lot of times when the bass are fixated on crawfish, all you simply have to do to mimic a crawfish is let that bait sit down there on the bottom. You know, a jig, when it is sitting motionless on the bottom, actually does have a decent amount of motion to it. Because if you think about a silicone skirt, there's a lot of different subtle currents that are happening in the water, and that skirt will be just kind of flowing and moving, and that looks very natural to a bass. And I've seen it even here recently that sometimes the best thing you can do to get bites is not popping that thing off the bottom or dropping it or dragging it. It's letting it sit there motionless, letting it do nothing at all. And I remember a long time ago, listening to Denny Brower talk about dead sticking a jig. Now, he was talking about dead sticking a jig in the springtime, which is a very good thing to do in the spring because you have a lot of fish that are going to be on beds and they're going to be in a small area. But in the fall time, I've seen it to be very effective as well. So do not forget to dead stick your jig in the fall. Now, the third tip when it comes to fishing a jig in the fall, and this is something that I think is very, 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 very important. One of the most important things is to look out for fish that are hitting your jig as you're reeling it back to you. This is something that I've seen a lot throughout the years, is that sometimes during the fall, you will have fish that are just simply feeding higher in the water column. So if you're out there flipping and pitching a jig, or you are casting a jig and reeling it or dragging it across the bottom, but you're starting to get a lot more bites as you're actually just bringing that jig back to the boat. Like I've seen this a lot where you're bringing that thing back to the boat as you're about to take it out of the water, whew, a bass comes up there and nails it. When that is happening, a lot of times that simply means that the bass are feeding higher in the water column. And so sometimes you can be fishing a jig actually below those fish. So what do? That can either mean, hey, start swimming that jig, start swimming the jig just below the surface, or it can mean that you need to switch over to a different bait like a spinner bait, for example, that stays a lot higher in the water column. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about fishing a spinner bait in the fall time, I'm going to leave a video linked right here that I did just last year, so you guys can check that one out. If you like this one, you're going to like this one. Also, don't forget to check out that fin fishing gear. I will leave it linked right here. I will see you guys in the next one.